states that actually have these out-of-wedlock laws on the books. It's not that they're going to go look for this, if you remember, but it's one of those things where if you get caught for something else, they might look to get you on this. It's a religious law, but do you remember why a number of groups said that we needed to keep these laws that was not a religious reason? What was the reason that this should stay on the books? Had nothing to do with religion.
That joke had to be made.
Not everybody at once.
Yeah, not everybody at once. What was the reason? Domestic violence. If you remember on that one, domestic violence is much lower in married homes. It is much higher or much more likely to be reported in shack-up or live-together arrangements out of wedlock. Protecting our kids we dealt with. You remember rape kits?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
What was rape kits?
You have to pay money for your own rape kit?
How much?
1,600? 1,600.
Okay, it was about $1,600 if you did not have insurance and there was no money in the state fund. It's $50 if you had insurance. What if you didn't have insurance, but if there was money in the state fund? Do you remember?
$1,000.
It was about $1,000, yeah. And on this, if you don't pay for the rape kit, then you don't get the necessary evidence unless there's some really good eyewitnesses in order to be able to gather the conviction. What was the controversy on this?
The fact that
Because some people can't afford to pay for rape kits, so they'll get away. And usually, isn't it the white girl who gets
The white girl that gets shaved? What did you say? The white girl that gets saved? What are you talking about?
Never mind, I was talking about the other rape one.
Oh my God, you know, this is all going to be on film. People are going to get fired over this. Basically what they're saying on this one is, when you think about it, if I've got to have money in order to make a decision after that kind of a thing has happened, number one, I might not get the evidence because I don't have the money, and number two, I might not even be comfortable enough to make that decision. And the article's title was second offense. So the first offense was the fact that they got raped. The second offense was now I got to pay in order to get my evidence collected. If they get a conviction, is the person that gets convicted required to pay the cost of the rape kit? No, and in fact, even in the article it mentions that sometimes you pay for the rape kit and you don't even get the money, or you don't even get the chance to use the evidence anyway. So this is a really, like a he said, she said kind of a thing. What state was this, by the way?
Was it North Carolina?
Yes, it was. It was not Carolina. I don't know who said that, but yeah, you got to be specific. It was North Carolina as the state on this, and they're a little bit more pro-man, if you will, than pro-woman. Getting into the executive chapter, and you know, I don't want to take too much of your time today, but looking at the executive chapter on this. Any questions about any of these terms? Go ahead.
the Sawyer case?
What was the Sawyer case, Youngstown versus Sawyer? This case dealt with one specific example of presidential power. Go ahead.
The mills, the steel mills,
About the steel mills, yeah. Do you remember who the president was?
Truman.
Truman was the president, Sawyer was his Secretary of Labor, and Youngstown Steel in the middle of the Korean War, what did they do?
They went on strike.
They went on strike. How much of the, what percentage of American steel did Youngstown produce at that point? It was, who said 40? Yeah, it was like 40% of the steel. So when they go on strike, this is going to have an impact because the military needs steel. Because who are we fighting in the Korean War?
China.
China. And even if China doesn't have a lot of guns, they've got a lot of people. And back in those days, you needed to make sure that you were fully ready to go. Well, in this case, what did Truman do? Well, what power was he using in the Second Amendment, the second article?
Commander-in-Chief.
Commander-in-Chief power. And what did Truman try and do in order to help the troops? Tried to force the workers to stop their strike and go back to work to produce the steel. Okay, so when this happened, the Supreme Court came up with 3 tests. What were the 3 tests of presidential power?
Had to be outside the country.
Now that's part of the ruling. Hold off on that for now. But what were the 3 tests? Because in order to figure out if what he was doing was legal, there were 3 tests that they gave.
If
Go ahead.
Congress and the president were together, higher power.
If Congress and the President were working together, presidential authority is at its highest, and we will defer to the elected branches. What's the next one?
The Congress doesn't do anything, so you go to the president.
If the Congress is silent, the President still has significant Article II powers. we will be likely to defer to the president. But what's the third test?
They don't want to work together, so none of them get through.
When president and Congress disagree, presidential authority is at its lowest ebb, and the president is going to have the burden of proof to prove the action. It was the Taft-Hartley Labor Act that was at stake in this. And what was
The what?
the Taft-Hartley Labor Act was at stake in this? Do you remember what the provision was in Taft-Hartley that would have allowed Truman to do this? Or was there a provision in that act?
No.
What was the
There
one?
was, they didn't say he could, but they didn't say he couldn't.
They tried to give an amendment that allowed Truman to seize striking companies and make the workers go back to work. And when the amendment was proposed, it was voted down, so it was never added. So the final act did not say that he could, final act did not say that he couldn't. You're right on with this. So the question is this test one where president and Congress are together? Is it test two where president says has power but Congress didn't say anything? Or is this the third test where presidential authority is at its lowest ebb? It was the third one. Why?
Because when Congress killed the amendment that would give the president that power, that sort of demonstrated them being against what the president said.
That's exactly what it was. When the Congress voted down the amendment, this was Congress saying, Mr. President, we disagree with this. So then when he tried to do it after Congress voted down the amendment, the Supreme Court said no, and they struck this act of Truman down. He could not force these workers to go back to work. Now, Patrick, what was the point that I said hold off on for a second? You said using it outside of the borders.
Oh, yeah. President can't use his commander-in-chief powers inside the border.
Go ahead.
It's stronger outside of the border.
Yeah, you use your commander-in-chief outside of the borders, it becomes a little bit more like a military leader or a dictator, and that scares people sometimes. And in this instance, he was using his commander-in-chief on civilians working in steel mills. They had nothing to do with the military. The court said, no, you can't do that. So the key on this case is really commander-in-chief power and those three tests. Go ahead.
That's when you're able to make any decision, right, as a president?
I'm sorry, say again?
Commander-in-chief, when you can make any,
Military.
It's dealing with the military, yeah.
Make any decision you want to.
Well, his argument was, since this affects the military, I can force them to go back to work, meaning the people that were not in the military, the steelworkers. And the court said, no, you can't. You're using your commander-in-chief power inside the borders. You're supposed to use that power outside of the borders. That's what they said. What other questions have you got? Yes?
Executive orders and executive privileges.
What's the difference between an executive order, an executive agreement, and an executive privilege?
One more time. Say it. Yeah.
What's the difference between an executive order, an executive privilege, and an executive agreement?
An executive agreement is a lower level treaty
With
with
foreign nations?
Yeah, with-
Okay, does it require the consent of the Senate?
No.
Can you give me an example of an executive agreement?
something to do with flight birds over the United States and Canada.
There was a migratory bird treaty between United States and Canada. There was also, I think the chapter mentions George W., and there were some surveillance agreements between Mexico and the United States dealing with that border. George W., somebody's favorite president. You can turn the camera on you now. What is an executive order?
An executive order is like a law that Congress does not have to pass.
Executive order is going to be an order, basically the president making law. And when the president makes law, it has to deal with the Article 2 powers. And when you think about this, I think I had given you an example of an executive order that was really one of the most controversial things in American history. Dealt with World War II. Dealt with FDR.
Japanese internment.
The Japanese internment camps. Congress never passed that. It was an executive order that FDR issued rounding up all of the Japanese Americans into internment camps in order to make the country safer. And then executive privilege. What is executive privilege? Executive order is the president's ability to make law. Executive agreement is the president's ability to make treaties, foreign affairs, both of these without the Congress at all. What's executive privilege? It dealt with Nixon.
Oh, to be able to be pardon people and stuff like that?
Wasn't that? Anybody?
You can't snoop around his private affairs?
Secrecy, yeah. The idea with executive privilege is that you have confidentiality with White House or executive branch documents. In the Nixon case, what did he ask for in terms of executive privilege?
Secrecy?
He wanted absolute executive privilege. The Congress, if they requested things from him, they could not get it. And ultimately, what did the Supreme Court say executive privilege protects?
The citizens?
National security.
National security, troop movements, battle plans, these types of things. Nixon did not make that argument, so when he didn't make that argument, they did not allow him to keep they did not allow him to withhold the tapes. What other questions have you got from the presidency? Yes.
22nd and 25th.
What are the 22nd and 25th Amendments?
22nd is 2 terms, only 2 terms.
22nd Amendment is the presidential term limit. And if you remember on that one, in the beginning of the country, you could run and be elected president as many times as possible. What was it that started the 2-term limit? Actually, it wasn't FDR. What was it that actually made everybody think that there was only a 2-term limit?
Oh, George Washington.
George Washington himself only ran for 2 terms, and that's something to remember on this. George Washington set the standard for a lot of things in Article 2. This was absolutely one of them. FDR actually was the one that led to the 22nd Amendment, and if you remember on that one, now they say that you can serve, basically you can be elected once and re-elected once. If you were not elected, but you took office maybe because somebody died or was removed from office, whatever, how does that work? How many times can you be elected?
If it's over 2 years, you can only be elected once.
Okay, if you take over a term, so if Joe Biden took over Obama's term right now and it's only in his first year, he's got over 3 years left, you could serve out this term and then in fact you could be elected for a second one, and that's as far as it goes. When could you be elected twice?
When it's under 2 years,
If you take over after the midway point. So if Obama was elected in 2012, 2013 is year 1, 2014 is year 2, 2015 is year 3. Okay, if you take over in 2015, over half of the term is expired, you could serve that out, be elected, and then you could be re-elected. So you can serve basically up to 10 years as president. Yes,
But I thought George Washington was like the first one.
he was.
So, what, I mean, how did he set the standard?
Nobody else had done it. Yeah, since he did it and stepped away after 2 terms and nobody else had done it, everybody thought, well, I mean, he was our revolutionary leader. We trust him. He set the standard. This is the way George did it, so we need to follow this.
So it's always been like that since.
It had always been like that, but in the 22nd Amendment, they finally gave a 2-term limit, and they passed it almost right after FDR had died, because was the only president. He got elected 4 times. 4 times. What was the 25th Amendment? Because there's 4 parts to it. Dun, dun, dun. What? There's 4 parts to the 25th Amendment. And they're things that people don't always think about.
We just talked about
Say what?
it too. So we just did that one too.
We did just do that one. Section 1. In case of the removal of the president from office or of his death or resignation, the vice president shall take over. There's nothing really complicated or controversial about that. Number 2. Whenever there is a vacancy in the office of the vice president, the president shall nominate a vice president who shall take office upon confirmation by a majority vote of both houses, House and Senate. There's no controversy about that. Section 3 is when it starts getting squirrely. Whenever the president transmits to the president pro tem, the Senate Speaker of the House, his written declaration that he is unable to discharge powers and duties of the office, and until he transmits to them a written declaration to the contrary, such powers and duties shall be discharged by the vice president as acting president. Section 3 says that if, for example, the president is going to have surgery, the president can, under Section 3 of the 25th Amendment, basically put in writing that he is going to step away for a few days to heal, say, from this particular operation. And then he can come back and in writing, again, present this to the President Pro Tem, the Senate Speaker of the House, and he can become president again just like that. Do you remember the example of the president that I gave you that turned over power to the vice president? George W. did when he turned it over to Dick Cheney. Now, the problem on this is actually Section 4, and this is the one that people really don't know about. Whenever the president and a majority of basically the cabinet or such other body as Congress may by law provide, transmit to the President Pro Tem, the Senate Speaker, and the House their written declaration that the President is unable to discharge powers and duties